about to experience, Jackson Snyder presents. We will examine the life of our Master Yeshua by discovering his ancestors, family, and friends, by reviewing rare ancient manuscripts, and speaking to those who know him best. From the pharaoh Akhenaten, now experience, Jackson Snyder presents.
Greetings and welcome to Moses Restored. This is part 2, and our teacher tonight is Allyson Gary, elder of the pharaoh Akhenaten. Allyson, I'll turn it over to you.
Why, thank you, sir. All right, I'm going to do a little recap from where we ended last time, if that's all right, just to make it flow a little better. And the chapter that we're on now is called The First Individual in History, and it says, Akhenaten has been called the first individual in history by Arthur Weigel, Henry Breasted, and Flinders Petrie. This has also been the label of Moses, the founder of Judaism. In many sources, he is described as the first true personality in history. He has had a true impact on Western development and is almost universally known. So, who was the real first individual in history, Moses or Akhenaten? Perhaps they are the same man. Akhenaten was the first historical man to denounce polytheism and promote monotheism. In the history of memory, in Scripture, Moses was the first man to pursue monotheism. They're both called history's first individuals, but not the same person and not have known each other.
Weird.
The solution is that Moses was Akhenaten, yes. That he was exiled from Egypt after his removal as king, and that he returned carrying the symbols of his kingship to free the Israelites. Think of the serpent staff, right? Once this connection is made, it will appear apparent. It will show how important it was to keep it concealed. The evidence shown in this book will demonstrate how similar in thinking, actions, and desires these two were. It will show how they would have lived in almost the same time. There are 4 themes that meld these two together. The 4 linking themes are 1. Chronological continuity between Akhenaten and Moses. 2. Pattern of abstract thought increasingly evolving through the lifetime of Akhenaten, which can be matched to his later life as Moses, including the name changing. 3. Exclusivity of the leader in the singular uniqueness of both Akhenaten and Moses. They both viewed themselves as the sole emissary of the one God. 4. Yahweh as a God in context in the time of the late Bronze Age. So, connecting Akhenaten to Moses in time. If you cannot connect the time frame, the rest of the argument is moot. Even if they were similar in nature, if they lived in vastly different times, it was irrelevant. Even the best Egyptologists have difficulty plotting events in time. Egyptian chronology is not precise, but it can usually be narrowed down within 10 to 25 years. The known dates of certain astronomical events can serve to anchor timelines of the reigns of specific kings, but figuring the length of their reigns can be difficult. Horemheb, for example, reigned for 11, 14, 17, 19, 27, or 57 years, depending on which source is accessed.
Yeah.
The overlapping co-regencies of the Amarna period further complicate the process. The chronologies that the author uses in this book are based on several assumptions, but are regarded as the most probable dates by the scholarly. One is the ascension date of Ramesses II, or Ramesses the Great, which was likely in 1292 BCE. The second is the siege of the Hittites of Carchemish by Suppiluliuma.
Yay!
Yay! In 1327 BCE. Well, I was sweating that one.
Wow, that was quick too.
Little practice.
Yeah.
This was the year that Tutankhamun died because the Hittite king got a request from his widow Akhenaten, to provide her with a Hittite prince to become the king of Egypt. This reveals that Horemheb reigned for about 17 years, which has several sources of confirmation. This implies that Akhenaten gave up the throne in 1337 or 1336 BCE, that he first became co-regent with his father in 1354 BCE at about age 19. He ruled for 17 years, and that he was born when his father was around age 20 in 1373 BCE. Placing Moses in the time frame as the later alter ego of Akhenaten clears up many confusing issues of the Exodus and the wandering and the conquest of Canaan. The Torah says the Israelites were cursed to wander the wilderness for 40 years before they could enter Canaan. There is no meaningful answer provided for this wandering. If looked at as a broader chronology, though, the reason becomes clear. The time period after the Exodus had a series of great battles between the Hittites and the Egyptians, which ended in the Great Chariot Battle of Kadesh. The Israelites were simply staying out of the way of the marching armies of the two combatant nations. The Hittite-Egyptian peace treaty was completed in 1260 BCE, and then the land was clear of the two combatant nations. They were free to travel. Israelites could begin their infiltration and guerrilla conquest of Canaan. The oppression of the Israelites occurred under Horemheb, the Exodus under Ramesses I, and the wandering under Seti I and Ramesses II, which matches well with the detail of each reign. The massive increase in buildup in Ramesses under Horemheb matches the forced labor of the Israelites under Pharaoh at Ramesses. The earliest historical mention of Israel in any source other than the Bible is the Merneptah stela of 1220 BCE, which we have discussed before. It was erected by Merneptah, son of Ramesses II or Ramesses the Great, who had warred against several groups of nomads and pastoralists in Canaan. One group listed on the stela was quote-unquote Israel, and written with a person instead of a land determinative in the language, suggesting that it was then only an ethnic group without a large territorial base. Two other elements of early Israel past 1200 BCE are the archaeological record of early Iron Age settlements in central Israel. These are distinct from other settlements and showed an egalitarian architectural and material features, like circular settlement patterns. All the buildings were approximately the same size, and they were circular, probably to contain livestock. There were no cult images or statues. The ceramics were crude and undecorated, and there were no pig bones found, according to Dr. Israel Finkelstein. These people were termed Proto-Israelites by archaeologists and are probably the core of later Israelite society. The question is, why were there people of a distinct ethnic group observing the rules of food taboos attributed to Moses and practicing rules of equality living there by 1200 BCE? The second marker of early Israel appearing past 1200 BCE is the quote-unquote Song of the Sea poem found in Exodus 15, which records the miracle at the Reed Sea and how Yahweh saved the people from Pharaoh. This work has long been recognized as the oldest single work of writing in the Torah and was the foundation for the prose account written later of the Exodus miracle. Most linguists believe the poem was composed within the dates of 1200 to 1100 BCE. There are these three pieces of evidence for the emergence of early Israel: the Merneptah stela, the Song of the Sea, and the Highland settlement archaeological findings. This sets the time bracket to 1220 to 1200 BCE as the recognized beginnings of the ethnic group called Israel. This accords well with the time brackets of Akhenaten Moses and the oppression, Exodus, and wandering periods of the Israelites. It is also a good fit with the biblical pattern of the life of Moses. First, Egyptian prince. Second, exiled wanderer. Third, magical liberator and lawgiver. The next chapter is the pattern of an increased abstract thought in the life of Akhenaten. There is a pattern of increased abstract thought in the mind of Akhenaten throughout his life. There is evidence of change in the progressions of his life. Prince to crown prince, to co-regent with his father, to leader of a new community of ideas and practices, to high priest, to foreign diplomat, then to a ruined and exiled leader. This progressed in increased abstraction and involved images, names, writing, and ideas. There is a polytheistic tinge in many of the early inscriptions of Akhenaten. In the first 4 years in Karnak, he was a servant of the official state god Amun-Ra, and his name Amenhotep means Amen is pleased. There's a depiction of him worshiping before Amun-Ra. There was another deity grabbing his attention, the anthropomorphic god Aten, who seemingly was simply the sun god Ra-Horakti, but with new titles like Living, Shu, and the Aten. Originally depicted as a falcon-headed man with a sun disk on top of his head, in his second year, Akhenaten named the Aten a completely new formal name. This quote-unquote teaching or didactic name was unique in Egyptian history. Quote, living Ra-Horakti of the double horizons, who rejoices in the horizon, in his name of Shura, who is in the Aten sun disk. End of quote. Long name. He is no longer a man with a falcon's head. He is a sun disk with the royal Wadjet headpiece. The sun was moved to the center of the composition and over the king, with rays outstretched over the king and his family. It was truly an innovation in Egyptian art. Since the Old Kingdom times, deities were always shown speaking to the king face to face on one side or the other in the composition. Small portable sandstone blocks called talatat were used to build 4 different temples in Karnak. These temples were torn down and destroyed, but the reconstructed remains show many important scenes of artistic transition with experimentation in styles. The Aten imagery was evolving, and so were the faces and bodies of the royal family. Some can even be seen in a single scene. In one, Akhenaten's face is done in the new style, but Nefertiti's face is in the older classical style. The most exaggerated of the statues of Akhenaten are the quote-unquote colossi of Karnak, which have led to speculation about a physical disorder in the king. The new art style depicted the king with bulbous breasts and hips, fleshly lips, spindly legs, and ample buttocks. The chief sculptor, named Beck, made mention that the king had directed this new style, saying Beck was, quote, a disciple whom his majesty himself instructed, end of quote. These statues were created during his first few years at Karnak and probably represent theological concepts. In his third year, he chose to enclose the new didactic name of his deity inside of 2 royal cartouches in a manner usually reserved for the name of a pharaoh. Also, never before seen in the history of Egypt, it showed his shifting his deity to a monarch of the heavens. The temples he built without roofs, like Heliopolis' sun temples, in a trend that came to Amarna, but without the hidden areas like Amun's temples at Thebes. Over the next 4 years, Akhenaten and his whole family and court moved to the new city of Aten, or Amarna, in year 5. He changed his official throne name to align more closely with his religious belief in the Aten. He removed Amun from his name and substituted Aten to become, quote, the shining one of Aten, unquote. He began taxing the Amun temples instead of donating funds to them, as had been the norm. He formally abandoned his worship of Amun and only worshipped his new god, Ra-Horakti, in the form of the light of Shu. Sorry.
Oh, I just said, did you hear that?
Oh.
This is something that's very unique. Moses and the temple crowd later taxed the people.
True.
Akhenaten taxes the people. Does not accept offerings for the temple stuff. Does not accept in-kind donations. Just taxes its member. Thank you. That's really good to know. Well, it's unique, and the fact is you don't find that very often. Usually on these temples, the rich king builds them, owns them all, and decides who comes and goes. Here, at least we have the idea that people are making their own decision to come in by paying the tax.
True.
Thank you.
He formally abandoned his worship of Amun and only worshipped his new god, Ra-Horakti, in the form of the light of Shu within the Aten disk. And this and the taxes raised tensions with the priesthoods in Thebes. He reversed the practice of donating funds to all the other temples and instead began taxing them, as I said. During these years, fewer gods were depicted in art and in sculpture. Akhenaten had made no more depictions of himself with the solar baboons or with Amun-Ra. Shu and Hathor were shown less and less, but the king did continue to compare himself to Shu and wear the ostrich feathers and show his own image in the uplifting pose of that god. As the son of Atum, the creator god, Shu was the one that Akhenaten identified with growth. Also, as he saw his wife Nefertiti being like Tefnut, Atum's daughter. The king saw himself, his wife, and his family as the new divine family for the people's worship. They, in turn, worshipped the king and queen as the earthly manifestations of Shu and Tefnut, and did not worship the Aten. The use of stone in the construction of the royal palace at Amarna shows this worship, as this material was only used for sacred temples, not for palaces. Pharaohs were usually equated with Horus, who was the child of Osiris and Isis, who were lower in the succession after Shu and Tefnut. Shu and Tefnut were the family of the Heliopolis triad, so this signaled another shift in the abstract thinking of this king. This particular royal divine association was never used after this time and after his abdication. During the later years of the regime, this association was used less. The plural of the word gods was no longer used in inscriptions. This was a progressive trend away from polytheistic plurality towards primitive monotheism. The Aten was worshipped by the royal family, and that family was worshipped by the people. The 16th border stela at Amarna has the royal family offering praise to only the Aten as the sole guardian of the city. The king pledges oaths never to leave his city. Another major change came in year 9 when the royal name of the Aten changed. This agreed with the evolving teachings of the king as mentioned in several tomb inscriptions. The full name of the Aten was a departure from the previous names and showed a deepening level of abstraction in two ways, linguistically and graphically. It used plays on words which added deeper layers of meanings. The new name was, quote, living Ra, ruler of and or magical in the two horizons, the morning and the evening, who rejoices in the horizon, in his name of Ra, the sovereign, or Ra, the light, or Ra, the father, who comes from the Aten, end of quote. This new name holds several key differences which reflected the evolving philosophy of the divine. Akhenaten discontinued the animal god Horakti, the falcon god associated with Ra, and Shu, the god of wind and light and law, written as the animal symbol of the quail chick and the ostrich feather of Ma'at as well. These were thrown out due to their animal imagery. The ruler and light were put in place instead. The new name magnified the Ankh and gave extra emphasis to the quote-unquote living epithet. The Hequa, or Heqa, scepter, was added to the written version of the name, showing the deity was a kingly ruler, much like a pharaoh. The word it was connected with Ra, making this quote-unquote Ra the light, and or quote-unquote Ra the sovereign, or equally quote-unquote Ra the father. That sounds a little bit familiar, doesn't it? Classic Egyptian wordplay would make the Heqa mean magical when written as both the ruler of the morning and the evening, and his magic was strongest at those times. The idea of a living deity who was both a ruler and magical during morning and evening was later utilized by Moses as applying to his deity Yahweh. Yahweh was a king who was served by sacrifices and worship in the mornings and the evenings. This still remains prevalent in Judaism and its offshoots today. The 5 final years at Amarna showed the increasingly abstract thoughts of the king, as well as an increase in bigotry. In proactive disdain for other quote-unquote gods, Akhenaten had the name Amun destroyed where it was written in stone. This seems to have begun after his father Amenhotep III died in year 12. Masons chiseled out the names of the state god Amun, his wife Mut, and offspring Khonsu. They were chopped out even when used in the names of people, including Akhenaten's former name and the names of his father and ancestors. The plural form of the word quote-unquote God was commanded not to be used in writing forever. He, in essence, outlawed the idea of many gods and spoke into law that only one deity was officially recognized by Egypt and by the world. The names of other gods were randomly removed in a movement of increased intolerance. This was the first time in recorded history that a systematic force was used against the idea of the deities themselves and showed the first time that the Mosaic distinction of quote-unquote, there is only one true God was brought into being. All other so-called gods were inferior and needed to have their names taken out of existence. The Aten cult became the official state religion of Egypt at this time. It completely eclipsed the older and richer Amun cult. Akhenaten was specifically bent on destroying any man-made images of any deities, as he would not have idols in the land of Egypt. He clearly hated these human-made images as shown in his writings. Inscriptions made after his reign stated the need for an immediate replacement of a huge quantity of new cult statues to repopulate the neglected shrines. Tutankhamun and Horemheb both wrote of this urgent need, illustrating Akhenaten's destructive bigotry. Tutankhamun's tomb included images of what his predecessor despised: golden statues encrusted with jewels, glass, and faience, all of these other gods. This was in direct opposition to what Akhenaten worshipped, a god who constructed himself by himself, as inscribed in the tomb of Meri-Ra. The common people stubbornly clung to their old objects of worship, even through this total destruction of their old gods. There was an underground production of amulets. Small statuettes of the household protector god Bes and the hippopotamus goddess of childbirth and fertility have even been found in Amarna. Monkey images and those of Ptah and I believe it's pronounced Tot, Thoth, included one of Tot in his solar form next to a seated scribe, have been found as well. The hated name of Amun has even been found in Amarna, albeit far from the usual haunts of the king. Next chapter is Picking Up with Moses, the continuation of abstract thought. As the public and historically recorded life of Akhenaten, quote-unquote, ended in his 17th year of rule, he leaves a portrait of a man defined by his personal religious revelation, his appetite for change to more abstracted ideas, including his own name, and his habit of intolerance and oppression of anyone with different ideology. He appears as a man focused on defining the scope of his singular God and denying the importance of other gods. He seems obsessed with ridding the world of human and animal divine images. He seems to have lived to worship only one God, detesting the physical images of other gods and breaking and melting down the cult statues. Strangely, this is exactly like the man Moses, as introduced in the book of Exodus, where his story begins. Moses is spoken to by the god Yahweh through a burning bush, who later identifies himself as the God that Moses' ancestors, the patriarchs, had worshipped. In Exodus, a bit later, the commandments of Yahweh are revealed to Moses. The most important and frequently repeated throughout the Torah are the first two. The first is the prohibition of bowing down to any other god, as Yahweh is portrayed as a jealous God. In Exodus 34:14, Yahweh is actually named, quote-unquote, jealous. The second is the prohibition of making any physical idols, images, or statues, either cast from molten metal or carved from stone. These two commandments from these two men, Akhenaten and Moses, are so identical as for the idea of them both to have been independently conjured up by two different men appears incredible. They are known as the Mosaic distinction and represent the first step towards the developed monotheism of the later Jewish people. No other gods were legally permitted in the city of Amarna, which itself was dedicated entirely to Akhenaten's unique deity, the Aten. The ban on the plural form of the word God and the use of the names of other gods, along with the shutting down of their temples, dismissing their priests, demonstrated a great jealousy on the part of the king against the prevailing polytheism of Egypt. Jan Assmann states, quote, the position is reached not by slow development and maturation, as it were, but by radical rejection and aversion, end of quote. This is the same as the Moses of the Torah, who was a leader who was intolerant and singularly devoted to his one true God, Yahweh. The most important commandments of Moses were the exact same as the commandments most strongly affirmed by Akhenaten. Moses shows unwavering loyalty to his sole God and displays a, quote, radical rejection and aversion, end of quote, of all foreign gods, including the ones of the Egyptians and Canaanites.
You have surfed to Jackson Snyder Presents, produced by the Pharaoh Essene Yahad, a Hebrew Nation radio original. We'll be right back after this break. Clouds of Glory, Jackson Snyder Presents, is back.
Yom Teruah is the day of war, the feast.
The Torah does not detail how or why Moses came to these conclusions, or why or how he had such a keen and abstract mind. It would make perfect sense if he were Akhenaten originally, as Akhenaten had already come to these conclusions, and he had these attributes as well. This increasing intolerance is a pattern for Moses and can be seen as an extension and a completion of the policies of the pharaoh Akhenaten. We have found no records of this king ordering the deaths of the rival priests, but there is a sense from the purposeful defacement and destruction of all the names and the images of his rival deities, the closing of their temples, and the increased taxation on them, that the pharaoh may have progressed to the next step of annihilation of those who failed to honor his God and worshiped other gods. This may be helpful in understanding how Moses seemed capable of violence, especially against his own people. In the Torah, Akhenaten Moses progressed in his ideas from traditional polytheism towards the first monotheism, honoring fewer and fewer gods until only one shone through as the only one to be worshipped. His dark side evolved increasingly through his life, and he became angry and malicious towards other cults, ending in the death sentence on those who disobeyed by worshiping other gods, some of his own people, then the peoples of Canaan. There are other areas of his life where similar patterns of increasing abstract thought are found. These areas include ideas on death, magic, writing, and the law. These will be brought up in more detail later, but here is shown a little on how his mind was ever innovating. The king changed to writing the spoken word of the day instead of the older writing that was traditional to the scribes. He threw away many of the archaic symbols that made up the syllabic hieroglyphic stock in favor of phonetic spellings that used abstract signs, finally shifting to a pure phonetic alphabet that was evolving. This may have been the predecessor of Paleo-Hebrew. The king's concept of death began with the traditional tomb scenes, but later shifted to scenes featuring his quote-unquote godly family, discarding many concepts of the traditional Egyptian afterlife. He assumed the mantle of Osiris himself and eliminated the need for the people to pray to a god of the underworld. He finally discarded mummification itself and endorsed simple burial by the time of the wandering of the Israelites, and that is assuming that Akhenaten and Moses were one and the same. The king's reliance on magic began with the HRY-TP magicians in his court, but by Amarna, he had discarded the court magicians and lector priests. During the Exodus, Moses battled the court magicians alone, and the Torah includes very specific commands against practicing magic. The final area, law, shows that the king began his rule with himself, personifying the law as Ma'at, the female goddess. This morphed into the phonetic spelling of her name, then into the idea that the law was from the one God and not a goddess itself. He innovated the idea of using a covenant or quote-unquote oath type of agreement between his God, the king, and his people, the vassals, evidencing a complex mind at work that was far ahead of the times. Next chapter, or subchapter, exclusivity of the leader. The intense vision conveyed by the style of art that Akhenaten adopted, combined with the single-minded pursuit of his agenda of change, shows a man almost overwhelmed by his own thoughts. Akhenaten and Moses are set apart as unique men with an unique ability to talk to and quote-unquote know their personal God. The great hymn to the Aten presents the king's concept that, quote, "You are in my heart, and there is no other that knows you, save your son Akhenaten, for you have made him well-versed in your plans and in your strength," end of quote. Also, quote, "Since you founded the earth and raised it up for your son, who came forth from thy body, the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Akhenaten," end quote. On a shard of a baboon image from Karnak, the king states that he is, quote, "first prophet of the Aten," end of quote, and in the tomb of Meri Ra, quote, "Behold, I am attaching you to myself, the greatest of seers of the Aten," end of quote. This was an ancient priestly title from Heliopolis. In this way, Meri Ra was called the high priest, but he couldn't know the Aten without being, quote-unquote, attached to the king. The hands of the Aten only offered life to the royal family. Yes, sir.
That, are you talking about Merari?
Well, the way it...
The high priest, or they
yes.
spell it different?
They spell it different. They spell it Mery-Ra.
Oh, Meri Ra.
Right.
Isn't that the name that was prominent in the Begats and in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the War Scroll? Same name?
Yes, I believe so.
Same one. Okay, so there's a connection there. Sorry.
I think it might be Merari, but I could be wrong too.
I think, Gov, they spell it different in about every book.
Okay.
It might be Ra. Sometimes they spell it with all A's. Sometimes he's depending who you're looking at. So that's why I wanted to clarify if that wasn't the same one as in the scripture and in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yes, and sometimes it is written R-A for Ra, and sometimes it's written R-E, Re, for the same thing.
I never made the connection till now.
Yeah, it took me reading a whole lot of these books to figure that out myself. So, I have read a lot of these books lately. All right, let me find my spot. Sorry, there's a bad word there. The stela of the royal family found in cultic areas and in homes attested to this belief that the hands of the Aten only offered life to the royal family, and then they were to be worshipped by the rest of the people. Akhenaten was singularly exclusive at Amarna as never before conceived of. This high degree of self-imagery makes Akhenaten a man who seems to have been obsessed by himself. Moses was a similar figure, set apart from the rest of Israel. Disregarding the huge amount of post-biblical myth and literature about Moses, who was the most discussed biblical figure in later Hellenistic and rabbinic writings, there is much evidence included in the Torah suggesting that Moses was singular in his role as the sole prophet of Yahweh. The first bit of evidence is the fact that Aaron is consecrated as the high priest of the new cult of Yahweh. This matches with the appointing of Meri Ra as the high priest of the new cult of the Aten. The higher position of singularly knowing the God in a way unavailable to other humans is reserved for both Akhenaten and Moses. Pardon my cat in the picture. Number 16 shows an example in the rebellion against Moses while in the wandering. Dathan, Abiram, and On from the tribe of Reuben complained to Moses, confronting him on his authority as their supreme human leader. Moses cries out to Yahweh, exclaiming that he has not wronged any of them, and Yahweh opens the earth and swallows the men who oppose Moses. Intertwined in that story is another story of rebellion against Moses and Aaron, where they were challenged by the Levites, led by Korah, cousin of the leadership. Korah challenged the right of Aaron to be sole high priest, and a fire came from Yahweh to consume all of the 250 challengers. Another example is of the grumbling of Miriam and Aaron against Moses for taking a Cushite wife in Numbers 2. They suggest, quote, has Yahweh only spoken through Moses? Hasn't he also spoken through us? End of quote. This brings Yahweh to descend in the column of cloud to the tent of meeting to address Aaron and Miriam to set them straight, saying, quote, if there will be a prophet among you, I, Yahweh, shall be known to him in a vision. In a dream I shall speak through him. Not so my servant Moses. In all my house he is faithful. Mouth to mouth shall I speak through him. End of quote. Numbers 14:27, as well as these examples, have a heavy parallel with the words of Akhenaten on his boundary stela. Yahweh has heard the complaints of the children of Israel against him, the words of the quote-unquote bad congregation. This is strikingly similar to Akhenaten's assertions that he had heard terrible things uttered against him in Thebes, as recorded on his boundary stela. He said that they were worse than the things that his father or grandfather had heard. It was probably these threats that made the king relocate his capital to Amarna, where he could be devoted to his religion in peace and in isolation. Both men suffered from the murmurings of a dissatisfied people. Quote, these things were worse than those things heard by any kings of Upper Egypt. If I heard a report against my father, they were offensive. As for the offensive things in every mouth, saying, I will commit an offense against the Lord of Aten, my father, the Aten. End of quote. That was from Boundary Stela, an early proclamation, year 5. It is hard to judge whose ego is screaming louder, Akhenaten's or Moses. They both are audacious in their claim of sole access to the divine God, and they are both full of ego in their singular ability to understand and to relay the will of the divine to the common people, the quote-unquote children of Israel. Neither one had any qualms about ordering all of their people to obey their will. Akhenaten, the king, ordered everyone around, and Moses, the high prophet, ordered everyone around as well. No one challenged the authority of Akhenaten up until his abdication of the throne. When the people challenged Moses, Yahweh stepped in to rebuke the people with his power and remind them that Moses alone spoke to and for the Lord, which is from the word Adonai, which is very similar to Aten or Adon. The T and the D transpose between the two languages. Horrible things occurred to those who opposed Moses, including the 3,000 slaughtered by their own kin when they broke a commandment of Moses not to worship idols, also known as the golden calf episode, which scholars think was invented sometime later. Then the chapter is the God Yahweh in his late Bronze Age Egyptian context. Yahweh was the name of the God of Moses and the Israelites, who is still worshipped by the modern Jews to this day. The name quote-unquote Yahweh and quote-unquote Yah appear in Torah, including in the oldest section, which is the Song of the Sea. Quote, let me sing to Yahweh, for he has triumphed.
Triumphed gloriously, the horse and the rider fell into the sea.
And it ends, my strength and song are Yah, end of quote. Exodus 15:1-2. That's where you find that. This name was first found in Egyptian inscriptions from the 14th century BCE temple of Amenhotep III in Soleb in Nubia.
Woo! We were talking about this. Let's see, I was talking to Chris Crutchfield, I think it was last night in Los Angeles, about this very thing. I wouldn't have known anything he talked about had not you been going through this book. And that's one of the things that we discussed. Was this religion evident in the forebears of Akhenaten? And it sure must have been. And here you provided the proof of it.
Yes, I didn't know this either. You know, this was new to me. So his name was first found in Egyptian inscriptions in the 14th century BCE temple of Amenhotep III in Soleb in Nubia. It is also seen in the tale of Sinui, in the story where the Egyptian protagonist Sinui, or Sinuhe, goes to Canaan in exile. He begins to worship Yahweh, or Yah, in the land of Yah. The document is from 1300 to 1200 BCE, but was most likely composed much earlier. The name Yahweh also is on the 13th century temple of Ramesses II at Amara West in Nubia. These writings list foreign groups, including the Shashu of Yahweh, or the nomads of Yahweh, who are associated with other nomad groups such as the Shashu of Seir, or Mount Seir in Edom. These inscriptions bracket the time of Akhenaten's rule and show that Yahweh was worshipped by nomadic pastoralists in the deserts of the east before and after Akhenaten's time. Akhenaten and Moses were somewhat associated with Yahweh. Akhenaten would have heard the name spoken by his father, but perhaps in derogatory ways. The presence of this name in Egypt at this time means that it was familiar with the whole royal family, and that Yah or Yahweh was known to have had some authority in specific eastern lands. This fits well with the tale of Moses when he left Egypt and settled with the pastoral nomads who served Yahweh. It would have been easy for an exiled king who had rejected the gods of Egypt and then been rejected by Egypt itself to adopt a new god or see the aspects of this god as similar to his own ideas of his deity. The name of Yah appears during the same time as the Egyptian gods Amun and Aten, suggesting that he was a rival to these gods, specifically during and after the Amarna regime, and not afterwards in the Iron Age, as is usually assumed by scholars.
I thought it would be a great idea to put some of this material together and write a little book called The War of the Gods. I was thinking this very thing. I was thinking about Abraham, the story in Jasher about him going into his father's gods and destroying them and then blaming it on the biggest god in there. And I thought about this must have been a war of the gods because, of course, Egypt had so many gods. And here's just one that seemingly from some different place and time coming in and just taking over everything. Now, I hope that Yeshua takes that hint and comes into Washington and just really cleans out the swamp.
Amen.
Okay, I'm done.
No, that's good. That also, that thought and this, what I read about the Amun and Aten being rivals to Yahweh, somewhat validates the battle in Exodus between Yahweh and the quote-unquote gods of Egypt, lending a historical context to that portion of the saga. Let's see. I have a little bit more I can read, but it really changes subject a little, but I will read it anyway, and then we can review it again if we need to. An examination of the family evidence demonstrating that Akhenaten, the heretic king, was of mixed Egyptian and Canaanite blood shows that his grandfather was Joseph himself, the dreamer and vizier of Pharaoh Thutmose IV. If Joseph was a historical person, then so was Moses. The author will show how the family of the king was connected to the early family of Israel, even though the connection has been concealed. The beginning of the story is one of the oldest secrets of Judaism. It begins with the richest and most powerful family in the ancient world, and the chapter is called Finding Moses in Egypt's 18th Dynasty. Quote, "You are the mother and father of all you make. All that you make is dancing in front of you. And as for your august son, his heart exults with joy." End of quote. Tomb of Merirah, Amarna. Beginning in the golden age of Egypt, the age of the sun, exists one loose thread that suggests something deeper was going on. This is the royal family, the family that had joined with foreign blood. This was the family of Akhenaten. Some of the most well-known kings and queens of Egypt come from the short period of 40 to 50 years, which was the Amarna regime of Akhenaten. They include Nefertiti, his beautiful wife, and King Tutankhamun, the boy king who was thought to be Akhenaten's son, who inherited his throne at age 9. He has now been proved by DNA to be the nephew of the king and the son of Akhenaten's brother, Smenkhkare. Other family includes Ankhesenamun, the third daughter of the king and the wife of Tut, and also the mother of Akhenaten, Queen T, wife of Amenhotep III, who was the richest man on earth at that time. This family shows the Israelite lineage preserved in Torah. There is much evidence that the family of Israel spent time in Egypt and married into the royal line of succession. This intermarriage would ultimately be seen as what had gone wrong in the rulership of Egypt. The evidence shows that the Egyptian family tree closely matches the family tree of Israel. Israel, so much so that there can only be the one unique family tree. The Amarna period was the singular episode of the total reversal and attack against the dominant religion of Egypt. It was carefully thought out and bigoted attack from within, not a foreign assault that crumbled buildings and drove the country to the brink of extinction. It was led by the son of the richest and most respected king of that land. This had never been seen before and would never be seen again. It was a religious revolution involving the combined theology and rituals of generations of different men and women who made a radical break from the old system of tolerance and inclusion due to the quote-unquote revelation by a God to a single person. And that's where I'm going to end up. We'll move on next week.
Exactly what happened with Moses.
Yes.
Remember
exactly.
when Moses found out the name Yahweh, it says that Yahweh hated him and wanted to kill him. Remember that passage?
I do.
Wow. Well, that's great.
It's getting more and more interesting the deeper you get into these comparisons. What do you personally think? Do you think that this is lining up somewhat?
It's like taking 6 dice, throwing the dice, and getting 5 6s and a 5. Don't you think?
Yes, I do.
Lining up. I thought when I heard the premise of that book, I thought there's just no way, because I was thinking primarily because of the dating, because Moses seemed to have to come 200 years after Akhenaten. Well, in my way of thinking, anyway.
No, you're right, and I disagreed with all of this even 6 months ago. The book that I did before, I think it was Moses and Akhenaten, Brothers in Arms by Ted Lucas, talked about this connection, and I discounted it. I thought no. But the more I read of this particular book, it all started to make sense. And I think it's possible, because how many men would there have been at that time in history who had the same history, the same thoughts, and did basically the same thing? I think it was a continuation in the life of one man.
Well, there is one similarity that hasn't come up yet.
Which one?
Did Akhenaten have horns? Moses had horns, right?
No, that's mistranslated. I forget what the word was mistranslated to horns, what it was, though. Oh, wow. I'll have to look that up for next time.
I can't remember either.
But it was a mistranslation.
All right. So what if it did come up that Akhenaten had horns?
Well, then they would have to be the same man. How many people have horns?
I've only met a couple.
Yeah.
Well, that's wonderful. Anybody have a comment? Are we going to leave it at that? We have such an active panel tonight.
Well,
see, they're all of them, I look at them there, they all just have not moved. They're like this.
That's their avatars on there.
One of them.
Well, I do, my reading is a little much to put people to sleep, Oh, there's Kenneth. Hello, Kenneth. Thank you for listening.
Look at that beard.
Nice. Hebraic. Very nice.
Very good. Well, thank you, Allyson. We'll continue next week.
Yes, sir.
All right. And thank you all for showing up tonight and supporting this ministry.
Thank you.
Next time.
Shalom.
Shalom, shalom.
Shalom, shalom. Now I have somebody else's take on this Moses restored business, and it's given in song. Shalom and good night.